But then I also want to ask, is the environmental footprint of the healthcare industry?
Oof.
Yeah,
That's a big
yeah.
question.
It's a reasonable question. It's not much looked at, but I do have some figures. One estimate said basically that the US healthcare industry is a significant source of pollution, including 10% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Because if what you have is a system that's leading to ill people, then it's not a sustainable system. Then we need to include the offset, right? If it's arguable that eating more animal source food and less processed carbohydrate foods is going to produce a reduction in healthcare need, well, then how do we credit that ecosystem service in the conversation space?
Wellness isn't black and white, so why should your choices be? On High Energy Life, we dig into nutrition, health, and science with an open mind, inspiring you to make choices that actually work for you. Our mantra? Embrace nuance, ask questions, and always reserve the right to change your mind. Now enjoy today's episode. I'm your host, Carly.
And I'm your host, Alex. Take a few moments to brag about yourself. Let us know, what is your background, what is your education and your career experience that why would somebody consider you an expert? Why should people listen to what you have to say?
Yeah. Well, I could give you the smart answer, as in
Yeah, let's hear it.
attitude-wise. My background is forage agronomy, ruminant nutrition. That's what I was trained in. I've spent most of my adult life in forage agriculture, and we may need to pause now to define some terms, but we can do that in a little bit. I've been around and within the metabolic health community since I began my own personal journey in 2007. And in 2010, I started showing up at some events and realized that my agricultural background brought some knowledge to the metabolic health community that they were interested in. And I also have the desire to communicate the metabolic health community message back to my agricultural communities. And so I've been trying to build bridges. I'm trying to be pretty clear about where my expertise lies, although I don't want to minimize the fact that I've been doing a lot of reading and studying within these areas in which I didn't receive formal training. So there's some value in that, primarily in knowing what sources to direct people to. And then I also just want to point out that if you compare animal nutrition to human nutrition, you get some very interesting comparisons. So all of that together, I've been trying to, as I say, build bridges. I've been trying to introduce these other communities to each other because I think we have a lot to learn from each other.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And that's one of the things that I find missing in the world of medicine, nutrition, and health is, especially in the conventional system, a lack of interdisciplinary research and collaboration. And that hits home as well for me, especially both of us. My original career was actually in electrical engineering, and I went to school specifically to get into renewable energy. So I was a solar engineer. So the environmental aspect is still very near and dear to me, even though now I'm in the world of nutrition. So on your end, it sounds like you were already a very seasoned vet in the world of agronomy before you crossed over and included the human nutrition aspect into what you do. Is that correct?
Yeah, my final degree was from the University of Kentucky, forage agronomy, forage production, utilization, ruminant nutrition minor. I functioned for a few years on faculty at Oregon State University, then did an extended sabbatic, as I call it, at Hewlett-Packard, And no, they don't have an agronomic division. But using skills that I had acquired, functioned there, technical writing, project management. And then in 2011, I was given the opportunity to go to work within the seed industry for forage grasses. So forages are those plants that we grow to be consumed by livestock, excluding the mature grain. So that was my focus has been for a long time grazing systems. That's again what I was trained in, so that's not new. But then, as I said, in 2007, I realized I was the 51-year-old balding, obese, pre-diabetic. And, 2008, Good Calories, Bad Calories comes out. Fortunately, Nancy, my wife, was already 5 years into her own exploration of reduced carbohydrate dieting. And if you know anything about the timeline, you get some sense of the resources that weren't available then that are now. The landscape looks very different. But then, as I said, I had this opportunity to come back into forage agriculture and reconnect with a lot of people that I either trained with or under, or the industries that I was trained to serve. And one of my reactions when I read Good Calories, Bad Calories, my initial reaction was to get mad. Because the products of the industry that I was trained to serve have been, I would say, incorrectly demonized from a health perspective. And you don't have to look very hard to see how the environmental and the health claims sort of are used to support each other. Right? It's good for, what is the quote attributed at least to Dean Ornish? What's good for you is good for the planet. Well, I agree with Dean Ornish, but I suspect we're going to differ on the details.
The implementation, yeah.
And those details very much matter. I also agree with that statement myself, but yes, details matter. So before we get into the health aspect and the crossover, just focusing first on where you went into forage agronomy, and I'm wondering, what was the motivation for you to do this? Was your entry into that field, was it purely an industry-based interest, or did you get into the field similar to how I got into solar engineering, in that I considered myself an environmentalist, and I wanted to work in the field of environment and protecting against climate change and that type of thing. So what was your motivation for getting into that field?
Well, I grew up in suburban Philadelphia, so southeastern Pennsylvania, in a county called Bucks County, which had been sort of the agricultural supplier to Philadelphia for many, since colonial times. But it had become suburbanized, and so land had been converted. So I don't come from an agricultural background, but through a long series of events, I found myself in a 2-year school in upstate New York, and I needed an elective, so I took a field crops production class. I wasn't in agriculture at the time. I thought I wanted to go a different direction. And so this happened. And one of the projects that they gave us to do in that class was to develop a farm plan. And so I found myself on a dairy farm where I was looking at soils maps, and I was then looking at Cornell University is the land grant institution in New York State. And they, at the time, they may still put out a hefty document with all their recommended varieties for various parts of New York, which is a pretty diverse state. And so I would look in that to find the appropriate varieties of these different crops as I was proposing these rotation plans, and where am I going to apply the manure that's produced by the dairy cows, and how much feed do I need for the number of cows I have, and whatever other enterprises. I loved that. It was wonderful. And so it just so happened that the man who was the instructor for that course was an alumnus of University of Georgia. And so that got me from upstate New York to University of Georgia, where I completed my undergraduate. I did a master's degree in weed science, which amused my friends back in Philadelphia immensely. And then as I was getting ready to pursue the next degree at the University of Kentucky, I was all planning to do a pasture weed control problem. But I ended up taking a class from a pasture ecologist by the name of Carl Hovland. And he changed the course of my life. He changed the trajectory. And that led me, fortunately, I was able to still go to the University of Kentucky, but under Chuck Doherty, who is more focused on grazing behavior and pasture management. So that is how that happened. It wasn't any concerted plan on my part, but it's been this series of fortuitous introductions, the universe taking care of these things.
Mm-hmm. I love that path. It sounds a little bit like you were open to experiencing whatever came to be and following whatever.
Yeah, that might give me too much credit. But sometimes the universe needs the spiritual 2x4 upside my head before I'll notice. Like, for example, in 2010, there was a combined conference just up in Seattle. So that would be, on a good day, 5-hour drive. And all these people that I'd already been reading, Gary Taubes, for example, but also Eric Westman, I met there, and I met Michael Eads there, and I met Andreas Anfeld there, and Steve Finney, I think, was there. Jay Wortman was there. It was remarkable. And so I found myself invited to this dinner, where the big people were going to be. And I had that moment where you're just trying to decide where to sit, and you don't know where to sit. And you don't, so I ended up being stuck sitting next to Adele Height. And Adele Height is someone who also changed the trajectory of my life. And we ended up having a wonderful conversation that persisted for many years. And so there have been all these people along the line that have, added to, the quiver of ammunition for the argument. And the argument basically at this point, again, I got this from Professor Frédéric Leroy in Belgium, that human health, public health, will be harmed by any reduction in animal-sourced food consumption due to any reason, right? There's lots of reasons, but it'll be harmed by further reductions. I argue it's already harmed because they're not eating enough. But number two, that livestock in general and ruminants in particular are essential for sustainable food systems. Full stop. And number three, that the foods that we get from animal agriculture are part of our culture and tradition, regardless of where those started, right? That this is part of our ancestry. So with those three things in mind, then it becomes an issue of addressing some of the topics that get thrown at us from time to time. And, we met for the first time at COSI. And so, we know that saturated fat's going to raise your LDL, which is going to clog your... Okay. So fortunately, we have resources we can direct people toward and say, just... So But that's just one of many that we can talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure we could talk for days.
Yeah.
But those 3 points, and especially the first two, kind of bring us back to the quote from Dean Ornish, and I don't know it word for word, but basically what's good for human health is good for the environment. So along those lines, I'm curious, where do you stand on the combination of the two? Should we, do you think, be evaluating environmental impact and human nutrition as separate entities before then ultimately deciding how should we move forward with public health? Or should they inherently be analyzed as a whole?
Yeah, so there is this concept called One Health that attempts to look at animal health, human health, and environmental health. The thing we have to be aware of there is conventional wisdom does come in. And so we have to be prepared to pull those apart to make sure of the soundness of the basis for each of those topics that come in. So sustainability is a related topic, not necessarily complete overlap, but often. And people will say and I've said, if you're going to have an honest conversation about sustainability, there are several factors that we need to be looking at, and you could think of them as broad buckets. First of all, you've got environmental, let's back up. We've got societal factors to consider. We've got economic factors to consider, as well as environmental factors. And within each one of those buckets, there are multiple aspects. And so anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are but one of the factors within one of those buckets. And the system is dynamic. And so if we push on one, we will see responses, or the responses will occur whether we're aware of them or not. And so, for example, are we absolutely certain that reducing anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in livestock production is the thing that we need to focus on? Because what we can say is within ruminant agriculture, where the emissions come from is the feedlot phase, not the is the pasture phase, not the feedlot phase. Okay, and we can get into the biology of all that, but a lot of people, right, that's not where their mind goes. And so one
Just
thing
to
that
clarify,
just came to my attention here this morning is, the whole thing about lemmings, right? We have this image of lemmings running off the cliff. Well, that's a myth. Like that was created by like a Disney nature documentarian who literally collected these little critters and forced them to run off the cliff so they could get the shot.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah.
So now we have this myth that's used as an example to make a point that itself may or may not be correct. So it's like layer upon layer of all this. I don't even know the right way to describe it at some point. So let's look at protein, for example. We evaluate the impact, right, of different production systems on pounds of protein or whatever impact per pound of protein, right? Or whatever impact per calorie of yield, right? Or dry matter use. Well, if you're talking about human nutrition, you better be sure of what your metric of protein is. Because if all you're talking about is crude protein, which they mostly are, that's an estimate based on multiplying your percent nitrogen by 6.25 to convert it into crude protein. Well, that's not useful for human nutrition. And I've got a swine textbook here that I could hold up that's from 97 that's saying that. And the last dietary goals didn't mention this, right? For humans, this
And
is
can you just explain? I'd never heard the term crude protein before. Can you explain a little bit more about what that is and how it's not helpful for human nutrition?
sure. So humans have been trying to figure out or estimate the feed value of various items, starting, I would assume, for animal husbandry, but quickly that comes over into human nutrition. And so one of these systems goes back at least until the 1880s, if not a little bit earlier. It's called proximate analysis. And so they look at, dry matter, they look at organic matter versus the ash component. They look at the ether extract, which is an estimate of fat content, essentially, and crude. And then there are fiber fractions, which are really important in ruminant nutrition. But protein is a difficult thing because it's actually made up of amino acids. Well, some of those analyses have only recently been developed and standardized. Way back then, what they could do is they could take a sample of feed or food and they could analyze it for total nitrogen. And then, based on the assumption that all of the nitrogen in that sample was in protein, and all of that protein was 16% nitrogen, they take the percent nitrogen value, they multiply it by 6.25 to convert it into a crude protein estimate. And that's how they've used and accumulated decades worth of information. So when you look at a food label or in a table and it says protein, almost invariably that's a crude protein value. It's not a true protein value.
And how do you get that true protein value?
Oh yeah, it's much more difficult. So let's just complete the thought, because in plant source foods we can have a great deal of non-protein nitrogen. So if we have green leafy vegetables, for example, it's likely that they're going to have a significant component of nitrate nitrogen. Well, that's going to be converted into a protein just by the mathematics, not by any biology. Okay, so there's that. Then, as I said before, protein is made up of amino acids, some of which are essential, some of which are not. Essential means we have to have them in our diets. And not only do we have to have them, but we have to have them in the right amounts relative to each other. Okay, so now we're getting toward biological value, but this is getting more and more complicated unless we're just including animal source foods. Then we don't have to worry about it. But as we restrict the diet and make it more and more atypical, artificial, constrained, whatever the right adjective is, then this information becomes more and more important. And so if you go back to the late 60s, I think it was, or maybe it was the early 70s, there was a book called Diet for a Small Planet by Frances Moore LePay, and there are many flaws in her book, but one of which was you could just combine these foods, and she's not the only one, but she was very prominent. You can just combine these foods and you'll get your complete protein, and that's fine.
And that's like you're talking about like the rice and beans pairing. You hear a lot of
Exactly.
like plant-based people talk about pairing their proteins. That's what you're referring to?
Exactly. The problem, though, is you have to do that at every meal, and you have to do it correctly. There's no storage, right? So what we understand is if we don't have sufficient amounts, because we don't need these essential amino acids in the same amount. So some we need more of, some, okay, but if we don't get enough of one of those, it stops protein synthesis. And so any amino acids that are present above whatever level that was we're just going to deaminate them, we're going to burn the carbon skeletons, we're going to excrete the nitrogen. So there were these sort of like the lemmings. There was this concept that was promoted, and it's still believed. But now there's a technique called DIAS, digestible indispensable amino acid score. And going back almost 13 years now, an FAO expert panel said, this is what we need to be using. And the most common manifestation of this methodology is to take pigs in which they have surgically implanted a cannula or a port into the ileum, the juncture between the small intestine and the large intestine, so that they can carefully measure what's going in the mouth, and then they can pull samples of the chine, of the digesta as it flows, and see what's left prior to it entering the large intestine, where it would be subject to microbial contamination, right? Because the microbes make protein, so you want to be sure that you're not getting any of that. And determining how well individual foods are meeting the requirement, and then you can also build meals out of it. So,
oh yeah, I could see how that would be really useful. You know, we absorb all of our nutrients in the small intestine.
well,
It's kind of figuring out what went in and what's left.
swine nutritionists have been balancing the rations for their pigs on an individual essential amino acid basis for almost half a century. Which
So
gives you,
ultimately,
Yeah.
what I'm hearing is, because there's always the debate between the plant-based versus animal-based communities of plant-based proteins and the digestibility and the bioavailability and the combination of amino acids need to be correct. And so the protein value that we assign to, or historically assigned to, each of the different plant forms of food, it's 30 grams of protein from beans and rice does not have the same effect as 30 grams of protein from beef. Now, what I'm also hearing is that even the way that the 30 grams of protein in rice and beans was calculated historically via those nitrogen values may be overestimating that 30 grams. Is that
well,
a
so
correct
there's
summary?
many problems here. One is, so the previous, not this latest edition, but the previous edition of the dietary guidelines used a concept called ounce equivalents of protein. And when somebody finally went and looked at those, they couldn't find what those were based on. And when they looked at it, they determined that they weren't. So this is the idea that you need to eat, like, I don't know, I'm going to make it up, 1.5 cups of cooked kidney beans to get the same amount of protein that you would get from an ounce of meat, cooked meat. Okay. But when they went and looked, they couldn't find out what was the basis for those. They just sprang
red
into
flag.
existence. And when they looked at them, they said, well, but these aren't metabolically equivalent in any way. And so that's the basis of a lot of this. It has to be in order for them to maintain their argument. But when you look at, they're unfounded. And then if you look at really vulnerable populations like children, the quote that I remember is from one of the preeminent protein researchers saying that an 8-year-old boy, he said in India, I don't know why it has to be in India, but that was his quote. An 8-year-old boy in India physically cannot eat enough rice and lentils to meet his...
Yeah, there's a lot of vegetarians in India.
to,
Maybe that's why.
to meet his lysine requirements. If he had unlimited access, he's just physically limited by gut size. And then you imagine everything else he's going to be getting by trying to eat enough. And lysine is a globally limiting amino acid. because it's limiting in cereals, and cereals are the biggest source of crude protein in humanity's food supply. So the mythos, if you will, that's probably not the right word, but this idea, the narrative, is unsupported by our best, latest information. And so then add on top of that, if in fact the majority of the human population is metabolically unwell to varying degrees, then their energy source should likely not be carbohydrate. Okay, so so now we have to worry about providing sufficient, not animal source protein, but animal source fat as well. And so this then gets us right back into forage agronomy, because a big part of this has to be coming from ruminants, because they do not compete for land, they do not compete for food resources, despite what people say. So it's a big challenge that's in front of us. And part of my efforts are driven by at least my theory that we need to get more people aware of this. Like, people across agriculture are largely aware of these issues. Mm-hmm. But it's the people outside of agriculture that drive policy and funding from private organizations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what can we find that's a common point? Oh, how about the burden of chronic illness? Because if these people that we've been introduced to are right, it's well over half. Some are saying 90%. Depends, right? But most people now, sick is now normal, statistically speaking. And that's not merely in the high income countries. This is a global, because it's malnutrition. And so that gets us into some other areas where malnutrition has been treated. Oh, well, we've got the deficiency, right? The lack. And then we've got overnutrition. And that's where we put obesity, implying that if you just ate less or you exercised more, we deal with obesity. Well, what if obesity is merely a manifestation of this imbalance of nutrients? What if malnutrition is merely any diet that evokes a metabolic derangement for whatever reason? Well, now we've got sort of a unified target to work against. But then, of course, we have to define what are the requirements? You know, what are the markers for health?
We're talking about health, and you've already talked quite a bit about protein, and then you brought up animal-based fats as well. So those are all macronutrients. Do you look at any specific micronutrients and the discrepancies between plant versus animal foods?
Oh, yeah. I think it's fair to say that there's a list of globally limiting nutrients. We have good information that the rate of stunting of children under 5 years old globally, which sits somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of children in that age group being stunted, that's due to a lack of animal source foods. Okay, now maybe that's there are other factors. One of the things we need to acknowledge is there's more to nourishment than nutrients. Right, so there's lots of things to look at, but nutrients are the base, right?
Yeah.
That brings to mind, and I don't remember the exact name of it, but the Diet for Planetary Health 2.0 or something like that came out recently, where they covered, and I haven't read through the full report, so you may be able to correct me, but ultimately...
The Eat Lancet report?
Yeah, I think it was part of the Eat Lancet report. And right. They talked about the ideal diet, and people should be pushing more towards a plant-based eating unless you're in a demographic that is but younger than like young teens, or you're a pregnant woman, or you're aging, or you're already malnourished.
Which is crazy. You just described mostly everybody.
And
Yeah,
then,
other than that,
okay, well, that covers the vast majority of the population.
yes.
It's like, okay, for
well,
10 years,
humanity's
you're
diet is
midlife,
already
maybe.
plant-based. Right? The vast majority of our calories are coming from plant-sourced foods. Those are dominated, let me just get to it, so I haven't yet committed this to memory. Half of our calories in humanity's food supply come from cereals. Wheat, rice,
And that's your
corn,
grains, like, yeah,
oats.
corn.
Okay, not breakfast items, but the food. Okay.
Yeah.
Sugar and sweeteners are 10%. So we're up to 60%. Okay, then vegetable oils are 12%. Animal source foods are only 20%. Non-starchy vegetables, okay, right? Like this is the diet where, because everybody assumes that, well, that's less than 10% of our calories globally in the food supply come from non-starchy vegetables and fruits. So now the next thing is to try to tease out the low sugar fruits out of that category. Ever wonder why we say fruits and vegetables as if they're synonymous? Why do we group those together? Are they the same? No, they're not. Okay, sorry, but I digest. So all of these topics, there's a great deal of nuance, obviously. There's a great deal of confounding, obviously. There's a great deal of, as I said before, there's more to nourishment than nutrients. So when I start talking to people about we need more animal source food in the diet, well then in a world where 45% of humanity consumes less than 1,000 kilowatt hours of power per person per year, which is like a large North American refrigerator. Okay, like 2 billion human beings don't have access to a reliable electricity. 1 billion human beings are still burning dirty biofuel, including dung, by the way, as their primary cooking fuel. Okay, so all of these issues, we need to have this, broader picture. But for as long as I can remember, there's been these series of by 2050, the world will blah, 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 and then there's all the challenges that are going to come, And one of those is that we're going to have a 2/3 increase in demand for animal source protein. Now, part of that is because we're expecting another billion humans. Okay, fine. But I got some questions. One is, based on what target? Are you driving toward a 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight goal for protein? Or are you going towards a 1.2 to 1.6 goal? See, even that is in flux.
That's a big difference.
Okay, so that would matter. But then on top of that, the explanation beyond population growth is that the population is going to become increasingly prosperous. And so they'll be able to afford more animal source protein, which apparently humans want when they can afford it. Gee, okay. So, but do we have any historical evidence that would suggest maybe greater access and consumption of animal source food leads to conditions which favor economic development? And yeah, we do. It's called colonial North America, to just take one example. And so now, in every case, no. Is it sufficient by itself? Probably not. But if it is one of those things that can contribute to conditions that lead to economic development, shouldn't that be part of the policies? Right? And right now it's sort of, we lump it into these plagues of prosperity mindset that say, well, basically it's your fault because you're too wealthy. And if you just weren't so wealthy, then you wouldn't have these problems. Which is a weird thing and only the wealthy entertain that. The people in the rest of the world are like, well, let me, what is it? The rich man says or the fed man says that the apple has a worm in it, and the hungry man says, let me see. Right. Very different perspective.
Yeah, this is what you're talking about. It makes me think of back the whole image of lemmings and jumping off the cliff, and I like that imagery because one, what it signifies is groupthink, right? We're
Herd
all
mentality.
we all have heard something for our whole lives growing up, and so that's just what we all believe without questioning it. And then two, I wasn't aware, but like you said, apparently that this image is not. Lemmings don't actually do that. It's this fake scene that was contrived for a movie. If we could get into a little bit of the misconceptions around animal-based and ruminant-based food.
Yeah.
You brought up earlier about how cattle don't compete for land with plant-based human foods. And I think that would surprise a lot of people.
Yeah, that's a big argument that you hear a lot.
So talk about a little bit how that is possible. 'Cause
Or other
how-
misconceptions that you hear of a lot, like they use a lot of water or they raise greenhouse gases. Anything else that comes to mind?
Right. So there are a lot, and we just part of the challenge, of course, is to have respectful conversations long enough for some of this information to come in, or at least act in a way that doesn't shut people down. And I try, but I'm don't always succeed. Some days are better than others.
It's an art form.
So if one of the examples I use for the land question is that if you imagine the land surface of the world being within the boundary of a football field, so between the sidelines, between the two end lines, right? Not the end zone, but okay. So we're talking about 100 yards, basically. Agricultural land would go from one goal line to about the 38-yard line. So only about 38 something in there percent of the land area of the world is considered agricultural. Now,
And when you say agricultural, is that for plants or animals or both?
well, that's just exactly the point, and many people don't question that. It's a broad category called agricultural. This is just where you find the statistics. There's another category of land called arable land. This is the land that's suitable for tillage. Okay, so all arable land is agricultural, but not all agricultural land is arable. It's a subset of agricultural land. That would get you from the goal line to about the 10 or 11. Its own 10 or 11. Going, very small. Like less than a third. Now, not all of that arable land is similar. So there are different classes in the U.S. that are used to describe how resilient that land is. How much effort do you have to apply in your management to prevent it eroding or degrading? So your class ones are the best soils. Unfortunately, we don't have a universal term for global. But if you kind of apply across all of them, that would get you from the goal line to the 1 yard line. So just
Wow.
okay. So now what that says is the vast majority of the agricultural land is best or solely suited for the production of this high fiber, low fat, poor protein quality biomass that ruminants could use and do use to produce food and fiber and other services. And if done properly, can provide a number of other ecosystem services. Whereas the amount of land that's suitable for the production of annual crops is very small. Now, we also need to recognize that it's not an either-or situation, that animal agriculture and plant agriculture, don't like it, but just for purposes of conversation, are integrated already. So the same land that's used to produce a crop can also be grazed, sometimes in the same year. Also, when we harvest a crop and process it, it produces materials that can be fed to livestock that are not human utilizable. So if you stand back and look at all of the domesticated ruminants globally, so all the sheep, all the cattle, all the buffalo, all the bison, all the, dairy and beef cattle, right, the goats, all of it. Of all the feed that they consume, less than 4% is human utilizable. And that's the cereals. I would argue it's a really great investment, but okay. Number two, agriculture is nothing more, well, my definition, agriculture is the story of humanity modifying its environments to produce more edible biomass than is naturally produced. And this goes back many millennia, long before we're used to thinking of it, back to the lemmings, right? Agriculture began in Mesopotamia. Well, okay, how about all the people that practiced burning? Are we finding that in the fossil records? Yes, we are. But it's hard. I mean, how do you tell the difference between lightning strike fire? Okay. There are agricultural systems that occur around the world independent of each other. But the point is that the vast majority of the biomass that even is produced in agriculture, like 15% of that biomass is human edible. One estimate from Germany, some work done, said that for every kilo of vegan food that's produced, that was their term, 3 to 4 kilos of inedible biomass are produced. And
So effectively, the quote unquote waste products that somebody that is eating plant-based, all of the rest of the plant that somebody is not eating, that can in effect be quote unquote upcycled through a ruminant animal to turn that into additional food biomass and quality proteins for humans. So effectively, when you include all this in, what it sounds like is we can drastically amplify not only the number of calories fed per acre of land, but also the quality of these calories are being improved by having ruminant animals included on that land.
Well, yes, absolutely. And let's take it further, because ruminants can utilize non-protein nitrogen. Well, specifically, the microbes in their rumen can take that non-protein nitrogen and make microbial protein from it, which the host animal then digests later in its digestive tract. So, in fact, cattle in the United States systems are net protein contributors. They produce more edible protein than they consume. Okay, and
Nice.
then you get to other systems like, let's just pick one, Uruguay, where basically their pasture systems completely, you literally cannot calculate it because you can't divide by zero, right? Pounds out, pounds in. Well, pounds in is zero. You can't, okay. So that's a reality. But then on top of that, we've got minerals that become more bioavailable because the animal has utilized them to build meat and milk. We have vitamins, vitamin B12 produced in the rumen. Okay, so we have these sources of nutrients that don't exist out in the resource that is being fed. Okay, on top of that, we're now finding that when you produce crops, so for years and years and years, cropping systems involve fully plowing out whatever vegetation was present. Just destroy it, get the seedbed ready, put in your crop, then try to remove the competition from whatever tried to regrow other than your crop. Okay, and then we've developed various technologies that have helped with that along the way. One of the things that was discovered was, okay, if we could find a way to plant without tillage, in some places that would be very beneficial, right? A lot of these lands that are kind of marginal for various reasons. All right, so that was no-till, and that got practiced for a while. And then some other people said, we have this soil that after the plants are the crop is harvested, sits there kind of unprotected, uncovered. So maybe we could grow some cover crops that would provide some benefit. And yes, that was an improvement in certain circumstances. So cover cropping became a thing that then they would no-till into. Okay, so those systems. But then they discovered if I put a grazing animal onto that cover crop at some point and then plant following that, I actually get an additional benefit. So the actual action of the grazing animal produces some benefit within that cropping system. And so in various parts of the world, they're working on these integrated cropping livestock systems. So again, to the point, there's no either or here. The livestock and the cropping agriculture are integrated in a variety of ways that many people haven't realized.
Mm-hmm.
So the land, I
interesting.
mentioned the feed resources that go in, so that took care of the feed-food competition.
What about water?
Water, you need to be
Yeah, we
careful
live in
about
Arizona, so
what
it's very dry
form
here.
of water is being calculated. And so in some of these estimates, they've actually said, well, it takes so many acres to produce a calf, right? And so you get 35 inches of rainfall. So they say 35 inches times however many acres, and they say all that water went to produce the beef. What? How much of that water actually infiltrated the soil? How much of it ran off? And oh, by the way, water doesn't get destroyed by the cow. A certain amount of that water gets excreted. A certain amount of it gets breathed out as water vapor, right? So there's a cycling that takes place. And so and it matters very much in which environment you're producing. So environments like the northeastern U.S., where there's not a lot of irrigation, you're going to have a very different water use profile than you're going to have, say, in eastern Colorado. But we tend to come up with one figure and plug it in and say this is, so a lot of these things need to be questioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so then the other thing, and really the big monster, the elephant in the room when it comes to cattle, and actually the reason that I avoided red meat for so long growing up, given my environmental proclivities, greenhouse gases and especially methane from cattle. So can you address that, whether the misconceptions and what those concerned about methane production and so on may actually have correct, if anything?
Yeah, so the narrative around methane emissions from ruminant livestock have too frequently been oversimplified. And it started with livestock's long shadow, right? This idea that, livestock produce more emissions than all of transportation, right? And as it turned out, the authors ended up retracting that study because they admitted that they had made a mistake in the methodology. They had compared life cycle emissions from livestock to tailpipe emissions in transport. Right. So again, we need to make sure we're looking at apples to apples.
Can you clarify how those two measurements are different, the tailpipes versus the emissions from cattle?
Sure. So the tailpipe emission is just how much CO2 is produced by running your bus. It's not looking at all of the emissions that were created in the mining of the ore, the production of the metal, the tires, the concrete for the roadway, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So it's a small part of the total emissions that come. Okay? Versus they were looking at all of the emissions, all right? And so it also conflates the fact that cattle are part of a natural cycle.
Yeah, circular.
Right.
Yeah,
So yes,
circular.
you have photosynthesis, which takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It reduces it to carbohydrate, producing oxygen as a byproduct. Then a certain amount of that material is eaten by a cow, for example, and as a natural part of its digestive process, a certain amount of that methane is burped out. Note the difference.
Not
Okay.
suited.
Get the reference. Good. But that methane, when it goes back to the atmosphere, has a relatively short half-life. So by about 10 years, it has been oxidized to CO2. So if we have stable numbers of animals, we're looking at a cycling of CO2. And as we learn more and more about what happens in grassland biomes in terms of the input of carbon equivalents into the soil. So for years and years and years, we talked about how much carbon grasslands fix. And that was based on how much can we measure above ground and below ground, which meant we were going to clip the tops and dry it. We were going to dig up and separate the roots and dry them, and hey, presto. Well, now we're learning over the last several years that a significant amount of the photosynthate, the reduced carbon, is actually exuded from the roots to nourish the population of microorganisms that live around the roots in close association. In some grass species, it's somewhere between a quarter. I've seen as much as 40%. So we've been underestimating by a significant amount. Again, we develop new technologies, methodologies, knowledge. Okay. The EPA puts out a sources and sinks budget and looks at anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And this is from preceding administrations. So, and they bucket emissions industries, right? So all of agriculture is somewhere in the 10% range of the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions from the United States. Animal agriculture is somewhere around 4 to 5, and beef is 2 of that total, of the total. So you start with, let's say, 10 or 11 as the agriculture, and then you go to 4 or 5 for all animals, and then you go to 2 for beef. So that leaves somewhere between 5 and 6 for plant agriculture. So the idea that you could reduce the total by shifting, it's like, well, but there's going to be some compensation here, right? It's going to take more of this other food to make up for the animal source food, and it has its own emissions and environmental footprint. At the same time, they look at how much carbon is sequestered, they being the EPA, and so agriculture is within the land use bucket. Okay, land use change, land use, along with forestry. So those are the two things. So together, that category sequesters approximately 12% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. So already that one bucket is carbon negative. It's the only industry that is, and probably the only one that has any hope of being so. Okay, so again, it matters what the reality, where you start matters in your planning of the journey. Right? And too often it seems to me like we're starting at the wrong place. But then I also want to ask, what is the environmental footprint of the healthcare industry?
Oof. That's a big question.
Yeah, it's a reasonable question. It's not much looked at, but I do have some figures. Yeah. One estimate said basically that the U.S. healthcare industry is a significant source of pollution, including 10% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Now, clarification, fairness, those aren't apples to apples comparisons. They use different methodology. So where the EPA would look at energy and transport as separate items, this said things like, well, how much transport does healthcare use? And then they tried to put a piece there. And how much energy does healthcare use? And how much food is fed to people? Okay. But the point can be made, whatever that is, it's significant, it's discernible. And if these people are right that it's malnutrition, it needs to be part of the conversation about food systems, right? Because if what you have is a system that's leading to ill people, then it's not a sustainable system. Then we need to include the offset, right? If it's arguable that eating more animal source food and less processed carbohydrate foods is going to produce a reduction in healthcare need, well then how do we credit that ecosystem service in the conversation space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an angle that I've never thought about. As nutrition coaches, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how do we convince people that they can spend a little more time and maybe a little more money on the quality of food that they eat, and their health on the back end, their medical bills will drastically be decreased. But I've never considered the concept of health and the medical care and health on that front with the environmental bill. But I could talk to you for days on end about all these topics, and at some point would love to have another conversation and pick one of these topics for a deep dive. I know we have a lot
we didn't get to today.
But
please.
I think that's overall. I want to be respectful of your time today. So I think that was a great wraparound back into the theme of what I'm getting from today is one, the intersection again of environment and human health, and how it's so intertwined and it's almost impossible to disentangle. And two, just the complexity of accounting and the methodology of how do we allocate the carbon budget and nutrient budget to different aspects of life and the different decisions on how we all choose to eat. And so even without getting into any of the detailed numbers, just the story is so much more complicated than we've all grown up being told and we've all been believing.
But it's also kind of quite simple. Like from what I've gathered today, it sounds like if you're a lazy health enthusiast, just eat meat. It seems to be the simplest way to make sure that you're getting everything you need.
Thank you.
And Mother Nature's figured it all out for you.
That was the thought I was having. I
Excellent.
got, again, most of my ideas, good ideas, I got from somebody else. So I got this idea. I'm not that kind of doctor. Nobody should treat anything I say as health advice, right? I don't consult. Okay. But Dr. Ballerstedt says to be sure to take your daily meds, MEDS, which stands for meat, eggs, dairy, seafood, right?
Yes, I love it.
Whatever's
I love that so
appropriate
much.
to
I'm going to steal
you,
that from you.
whatever's available to you, whatever you like to eat, as long as that's a part of your daily diet, likely a lot of this detail isn't necessary. But if you want to dig a little deeper, come on into the rabbit hole. Oh, it's fine. You'll love, of course, you can leave anytime you want. No, come on in. I call it the Ruminati. This is the people that know this stuff. And then as we grow, maybe we can have more people who are exploring things. But right now I'm working on a project for 2 upcoming presentations. We'll hear people say things like, we can't feed the world this kind of diet, right? Reduced carbohydrate, ketogenic, carnivore, whatever. Okay, we can't feed them. I want to shift that. I want to say we must. We have to figure out how to do this. If these people are right, that we've been learning so much from, who have demonstrated all this improvement in human health and flourishing, then our responsibility is to work on finding a way for greater affordability and access within the environmental constraints, within the locations, right? To achieve this, because we will reduce human impact by increasing human flourishing. Impoverished populations, sick populations can't afford to be concerned about these issues that are half a century or a century down the track.
Yeah, you're in survival mode, not thrive mode.
So I welcome, contact. I'm glad we had the conversation, and let's do it again.
Perfect. So you
Awesome.
brought
Thank
up,
you so
you
much.
mentioned the Ruminati. So for those that are jiving with what they're hearing from you, where can people go to learn more about you and follow your work and hear more of your wonderful prose?
Well, so on Substack, it's substack.ruminati.com, or is it ruminati.substack.com? Look for Ruminati on Substack. Also, grass-based, one word on Twitter and Instagram. There are other places you can find me by name. There's not that many Ballerstedts around, remarkably enough.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique name. Cool.
Perfect.
Excellent.
And
Well, thank you so
last,
much.
before I let you go, and you can take as short or as long as you'd like to answer this, by the year 2050, that's a year you already brought up in this conversation, or in the future, what would you, if in your ideal world, what do you think our general food system should look like, both on the where it's being grown and also when an individual is going to shop? What would you want that to look
In a
like
perfect
future?
world.
Sure. In a perfect world, the farmers, the ranchers, the herders, we're 4 months into, well, we're in the 4th month of the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists. And so a significant part of the human population is still dependent on that way of life, and often in conflict with nations and settled borders and that sort of thing. The farmers, the producers of this resource need to be able to make a living. So recognizing that cheap food has a cost, and that if what we think represents the path to metabolic health is correct, it's got to involve different systems than what we currently are in. At the same time, recognize that in this country, at least, I have all these opportunities that many people throughout the world can only dream of. So when I gave the statistic earlier about electrical consumption around the world, it means that roughly half of the world is living in Chicago circa 1900. And they would really like to live in a little different reality. And there's all kinds of things that would facilitate in terms of education, health, and nutrition, not to mention others. So we need people with a different background than those who are currently dominating policy. And we need people who are genuinely more concerned about the welfare of human beings than some of the other things that seem to drive policy. And I say that because the policies that they espouse are going to end up impoverishing people. And so knowingly, unknowingly, don't know why we're there. In terms of the systems, there's, for a closing section of a significant textbook, I got to write the close. And I talked about a forage renaissance. So one of the factors that drove the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain was the development of what's called the ley system of farming, L-E-Y. They discovered that they could grow a short rotation pasture with clover in the pasture. They could graze animals for a couple years. They could then come and plow that field and they could plant a corn crop. Now, corn to them meant grain. So don't be confused. It's not maize. And so those are higher nitrogen demanding crops. So they got a good yield. And then they went and they would plant like a root crop maybe a year after. Okay. And then they go back into pasture. That was so productive, along with favorable climate, that they had so much money. They needed roads and rails to get to the market. They needed places to make investments, right? So this drove the system. So we're kind of coming back to that in this cover cropping and integrated. So it's kind of like a lot of people are discovering things anew that aren't new. And
Old-fashioned on purpose.
Yeah. So all of these things, I think, are part of what the future could be. And hopefully by building out the connections, building bridges, we can gain support for this vision across a wider part of the population, which is going to be necessary for the public-private investment that's going to be necessary to drive the innovation, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love that vision, and I think more and more people are coming to see that vision as well. So I think it's you definitely are a visionary by kind of looking to the past a little bit. But fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you. You've been a wonderful guest.
I hope that we'll be able to have many more conversations and especially deep dives into individual topics in the future. But for now, we'll let you go and enjoy the rest of your day and into the weekend. So thanks so much for joining us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks for tuning in. We're here to help you put what you've learned into action. Learn more about our coaching program at highenergylife.com. That's HIenergylife.com. Until next time, embrace nuance, ask questions, and always reserve the right to change your mind.